Tonight, we're talking about immigrants, education, and U.S. economic competitiveness, topics which are intimately linked. I don't think you can talk about one without the other, not to steal what Audrey may have to say tonight. But of course, immigration's been in the news, thanks not only to the recent Republican debate, but for many ongoing reasons in our region. So we're pleased to have Audrey Singer with us tonight. Audrey's a senior fellow at Brookings in the Metropolitan Policy Program, an expert on immigration, race, and ethnicity, particularly in metropolitan areas. And I know you will have something to say to her or ask her about Las Vegas and these issues. So I now will try and keep my word and stop talking so Audrey can begin.
Thanks very much, Bill, and welcome everybody. I'm glad you could make it. I'm happy to be back at UNLV. I can't remember how many times I've been here before, but I've been here 2 or 3 times before, and every time I come, I learn so much. It's so important for me to be in a place like this, to be on the ground talking to people and getting feedback and understanding local areas in a way that I can't sitting at my desk in Washington, D.C. So when I come, I have the opportunity to interact with students and faculty on campus, but I also tend to roam around the city and the metropolitan area and take in as much as I can with business leaders, with real estate people, with community leaders, and school and school district people who are actually working with the population that I'm studying. And so it's always a wonderful opportunity to come here. And today and yesterday, although it's a little windy today, the weather has been so nice. That's the cherry on top for me. So I just wanted to say a few words about how much I learn when I come here every time. So today I'm going to talk about my research on immigrants, their skill levels, their educational attainment, and their role in the U.S. economy. And first I want to place immigration into the bigger discussion and debates around U.S. immigration policy and trying to connect it with economic competitiveness. Congress last debated comprehensive immigration reform in 2007, and that's the last time they debated federal issues around immigration formally, and that happened 3 years in a row, and it failed. They failed to agree on how we should change our immigration policy. Since then, the U.S. has been going through the longest, deepest economic downturn in the post-war era, and we face huge questions about how to get back to economic growth and how to put more people back to work. And at the state and local level, leaders there have been dealing with shrinking budgets, decreasing revenues, and on top of all of this, the public, of course, has been experiencing growing anxiety about their own economic futures. So this is the backdrop now that we're talking about immigration following the highest immigration levels on record in the preceding several decades. So immigration is always a hot topic, but it's especially sizzling during economic hard times and during political campaign seasons, and we have both right now. We're in the middle of both. And so the public discussion around immigration lately has really focused on the issue of illegal immigration, the costs of immigrants to the U.S. and the U.S. economy. And it's diverting questions about how we can better change our immigration policies to meet our economic needs. And that's really one of the most important questions we have out there today. But having a rational and pragmatic discussion about this is difficult in these times with growing anxiety and when discussions are very superficial in terms of what's happening in the world of immigration. So this is a deep issue. I think that what's often lost in the discussion is how vital immigrants are to our labor force and the U.S. economy in general, at both the low and high skilled level and everything in between. We now have 40 million foreign-born people living in the U.S. They make up 13% of the U.S. population. They are nearly 1 in 6 workers in the U.S. labor force. While border enforcement and illegal immigration are a focal point, longer-term U.S. global competitiveness rests on the ability of immigrants and their children to thrive economically and contribute to the nation's productivity. So our long-term economic competitiveness is tied to major demographic transformations that are underway in America today. The majority of our growth in the labor force, in our future labor force, will come directly from immigrants and their children, and ensuring that the next generation of immigrants succeeds so that their children will be well prepared for the U.S. market, which is increasingly tied to the competitive globalized market, is one of the most pressing issues we face. So I'm not going to talk about the U.S. education system today, but I'm going to talk about education levels among immigrants and where they fit into the labor market and how that compares to what we know about the native-born population. But first, a little bit about U.S. immigration policy. So there is I think there's pretty much unanimous consensus out there that immigration policy should change, but there's little agreement on how it should change. Our U.S. immigration policy is horribly out of date. We haven't changed any major portions of our system in over 20 years. And in general, when you look at the history of major overhauls to U.S. immigration policy, it takes us about 20 years to make changes after big discussions. We haven't gotten there yet, and I don't think we will in the next stretch, let's just say. I don't know when. We have an admission system for permanent residents, the people who come here who receive green cards, that is, I'm not going to go into the details, but it's about 75% of the people that receive a green card on an annual basis are related to a family member here. About 15% are sponsored by an employer. But that number is a little deceptive because in that 15% there are the actual workers and then their family members. So it really looks like about 7% of all green card recipients on a given year come in through employment preferences, as they're called. And then we have about 10% of our incoming foreign-born persons who are getting green cards are coming in as refugees. And then there's a host of other temporary visas like H-1Bs that you've probably heard about, which are for high-skilled immigrants. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So as I said, there's little agreement on how to change our immigration system, but there are a couple competing frameworks out there. There's the broad reform viewpoint, and this is also known as comprehensive immigration reform. This is an idea that we have to do numerous things simultaneously in order to get the system back into shape and to be able to manage the future flow of immigration to this country. So it includes border enforcement and security. It includes changing our admission system, both the permanent and the temporary admission system. It includes internal and worksite enforcement and having employers be responsible for who they hire in a way that they are not now, and a host of other things. It also includes a legalization program that would take those who are here without authorization to be here, to work here, and move them into a legal status. And so that perspective says those things will simultaneously work together to kind of make the system, to right the system, and then to be able to go forward in a way that is secure and safe and fair. There are other perspectives that are focused on more specific pieces of the reform process. There's the employment focused perspective, and this is one that is about securing the borders and first, and then taking on what happens next. So in this version of reform, we are able to seal off the border, particularly the southern border, and to be able to police internally to remove people who are here without status, and to bring that part of the process right, and then we can possibly move on to these other pieces. And in that perspective, there is no legalization program. The people who are here illegally will on their own disappear or be pushed further into the shadows. So that's not the focus of that one. There's another, I just want to point out another specific reform perspective because it's relevant for this talk. And there's a growing movement among business leaders, among certain politicians, other community leaders, to think about the high-skilled immigrant and the contributions that we are either missing or lagging behind on. And this point of view says, well, we've got a lot of international students coming to the US, and we're not able to utilize them in a way that many of them are working in science, technology, engineering, and math fields, the STEM professions, but we're turning them away, or they're going to other countries. They could be part of our innovative economic vitality of the future. So that's the focus there. Not just on students, but also on bringing in more high-skilled workers because of pressure from employers who are having difficulty finding workers. That raises a lot of questions, of course, about our own educational system and who we are producing and how well that's going. But that usually goes hand in hand in these arguments that we need to focus on that as well. Okay, so that's the short version of U.S. immigration policy, and I know it's not very satisfying, but we need to talk about my research, of course, which is the most important thing. So I would say that, the big questions out there that kind of are overarching in this scenario are, how many immigrants should we admit? I mean, we are at a point in time when there's high unemployment. We can't take in the world's immigrants like we were doing over the past 10, 15 years at a rate that really exceeded anything we had ever seen before. How many should we admit? And what kind of immigrants should we prioritize? How many should be related to family members? How many should be related to industries where we have need, not just the high skilled that I mentioned, but also lower skilled immigrants, for example, agricultural workers. We rely heavily on immigrants for that industry sector. Who should we prioritize? And how do we modify our immigration policy? Again, this is the big question, to better meet our national and our local economic needs. Sorry, I keep going back to the beginning. So within this context, there have been several pretty seismic shifts as a backdrop that have influenced the political and the policy discussions around immigration. I talked about the economic changes that the downturn that we're in. We're coming out of a pretty bad recession. It's unevenly happening across areas in the U.S. But we've also seen major economic restructuring. We're moving towards a knowledge-based, technology-based structure in terms of new job creation in this country. So that's a big issue, and it affects different places in different ways across this country. In addition, during that process, we've seen, since the 1990s, the rise of new immigrant gateways across this country. There's a new geography of immigration that's related to the industries and the opportunities that have cropped up in different areas across the country. So in a place like Las Vegas, we saw very high rates of immigration throughout the 90s and into this decade before the collapse of the construction industry, housing market, and the recession that's hit this area and other areas in a particularly hard way. But before that, we saw, and I'm going to talk further about this, we saw many places across the country experience immigration in a big way for the first time, or for the first time in a long time in history. We've also seen, despite the fact that there has not been any major federal changes to the law, we have seen states and localities take action in a big way. And part of that has been a reaction to the lack of federal reform. And part of it has been pressure on local leaders to do something about immigration, in particular unauthorized immigration. And so there's pressure in local communities for elected officials and for other leaders to address this problem. And in some places, the solution has been to crack down on immigration, particularly in places where illegal immigration is perceived as the biggest part of the problem. In other places, we have seen laws that have cropped up that are supportive of immigrants, that tend to reach out to them and to try to move them into the mainstream with language programs, with programs in schools, with other kinds of programs that are more welcoming towards immigrants. So we've seen a lot of changes on the ground. And in my own work, I've been looking at not only settlement across metropolitan areas, but within metropolitan areas. And as of the last census data that came out in 2010, just a couple weeks ago, we were able to look at the whole decade of the 2000s for the first time. And there, in the data, we can plainly see that more immigrants live in the suburbs of the largest metropolitan areas than anywhere else in the country. 51% of all immigrants now live outside of central cities and in suburban areas in the 100 largest metropolitan areas. So that's a big shift. In 1980, more or less the same shares were in cities and suburbs, and that's changed over the last couple of decades. And so there's a lot of issues that suburban areas confront that are different from cities because of density, because of transportation issues, because of housing issues, and because of the lack of a history of immigration in many of these places. There is no infrastructure there that exists in more established and urban areas. Okay, so the big picture. I'm going to talk about a project that I did with Matthew Hall, who's now at University of Illinois in Chicago. He and I got together on this project because we've been talking about the perception of immigrants in this country and how little we actually knew from evidence, empirically based data about the skill levels of immigrants. And also because when we think about skill levels and employment of immigrants, it is one of their largest contributions to this country, because immigrants come here, most of them come here motivated to work, if not for the primary purpose of working throughout the skill spectrum. So, as I mentioned, immigrants are about 13% of the population. They're overrepresented in the labor force. They're about 16% of the labor force. Immigrants, and when I talk about immigrants, the data come from the American Community Survey and the Current Population Survey, both products from the Census Bureau that are done on an annual basis. The data, those data sets and questionnaires include a question on birthplace. So they ask everybody, where were they born? And so I'm identifying immigrants through this question on birthplace. And if you were born outside of the country, you're considered foreign born. So it includes everybody that fits that definition, but we can't specifically look at the legal status of any of those people except for those who have become naturalized U.S. citizens. So it includes legal permanent residents or green card holders, people here temporarily on work or student visas, but not tourist visas. It includes refugees and asylum seekers, and it includes those who are here in an unauthorized status to the extent that they are included in the survey. And of course, we have no way of knowing how many are missing, how many are there. We don't know that about anybody of any status in this country, even US citizens. So they're a big part, they're overrepresented in the labor force. Immigrants have slightly higher rates of labor force participation, but they have the same unemployment rates currently as the native-born workers. And there are several key sectors, big, broad sectors, and some smaller sectors in the US economy where we see foreign-born workers overrepresented. And in the among low-skilled sectors, that's in agriculture, in construction, in hospitality, and at the higher end, information technology, life sciences, and certain healthcare professions. Sorry, it's a new gadget for me. I've never used one like this before. So we were curious about where immigrants fell on a continuum of educational attainment. So we took all adult immigrants over the age of 25, and we separated them into three categories. High-skilled immigrants are those with a bachelor's degree or more. Low-skilled immigrants are immigrants who do not have a high school diploma, so they're lacking that basic credential. And everybody else in the middle are middle-skilled immigrants. We focus on high and low-skilled because that's where the policy debates are. So middle-skilled are immigrants with at least a high school diploma. They may have further training or an associate's degree or some other kind of technical training as well. So we looked at the data from 1994, which is the first year we have annual data available on immigrants and their educational attainment. And we looked at the trends in these educational categories over time. And so what we found, you can see right here, and we were very intrigued, given the ongoing debates and the rhetoric around immigrants, that during the period of the highest immigration levels on record, that's over the past couple of decades, the skill levels of immigrants in the US converged. And in fact, as you can see, towards the end of the decade, high-skilled immigrants now outnumber low-skilled immigrants. So those with a college degree or more now outnumber those without a high school diploma. And this just happened recently. Middle-skilled, the top line, the green dotted line, are still the largest share. But all three categories, keep in mind, have increased over time because, of course, immigration has grown over this period as well. What do we find for the native-born? This is the same graph organized in the same way. The trends are very similar, but there's a very small share of the US population that does not have a high school diploma. And in fact, when you look at the absolute numbers, currently about half of all of those people, of all the people in the US living in the US, regardless of whether they're an immigrant or US born, half, I don't know if I just said that right, but half of all people without a high school diploma in the US right now are US born and half are foreign born. So immigrants take up a much bigger share of the population without a high school diploma. So high skilled has been increasing among the native born as well. So this is what it looks like when you look at the numbers specifically over the decade. In 1980, there were twice as many low-skilled immigrants as high-skilled ones, and there was a 20 percentage point spread, so about 40% were low-skilled, about 19% were high-skilled in 1980, and as you can see over the next 20 years, the share for the low-skilled group drops by more than 10 percentage points, while the high-skilled increases by more than 10 percentage points. And again, the middle-skilled group grew in absolute terms, but they maintained more or less the same share, 41 to 43%. So you can see this convergence right here. About 28% of all foreign-born persons in 2010 did not have a high school diploma. About 30% had a college degree or more. So we found this to be pretty surprising. given the rhetoric around immigrants and the perception that most immigrants who are here are poor, from Latin America, don't have an education, don't have high wages. In fact, there are a lot of people who do not fit this profile at all. So one question is, what accounts for the rise in the high-skilled immigrant in this country? What has changed? Well, I did mention the knowledge-based economy has been growing. So there's rising demand for high-skilled workers across the board, not just immigrant workers, in new technology positions and different kinds of service sector positions that are based on information, knowledge, and that kind of thing. So there's more demand for these workers. We also have had several important policy changes that have brought in more high-skilled workers. So that's increased the supply of immigrants. The H-1B visa, which I mentioned earlier, the program started in the early 1990s and has admitted, for temporary purposes, tens of thousands of high-skilled immigrants since that period, and it's varied over time, and people can renew their visas for up to 6 years. But most of these high-skilled H-1B visas require a bachelor's degree or more. So that's augmented the flow and the size of that population too. Also is the increase in the number of international students in the U.S. Currently there are about 700,000 international students studying in schools right now. And many of those students are able to stay on through marriage, through work. You know, life happens, especially when you're a young person in school. You fall in love, you find a job, you end up staying. So there are a lot of, these are some of the major contributing factors. Okay, so that was the national picture. When we look at the top 100 metropolitan areas, which is where 85% of all immigrants live in this country, we looked at the ratio of high to low skilled immigrants. And here we found that 44 metropolitan areas out of the top 100 we could designate as high-skilled destinations. And that's where more than 125 high-skilled immigrants were present for every 100 low-skilled immigrants. Likewise, we found that for the low-skilled destination, there were 30 metropolitan areas that we considered low-skilled destinations, less than 75 immigrants with a college degree or more for every 100 without a high school diploma. And then we found 26 that more or less had balanced populations based on their educational attainment. So that's kind of the big picture. One question we had then was, how do we explain the perceptions? How do we understand where people are coming from when they are thinking about new immigrants and skill levels and what's happening on the ground? So we looked at the 100 largest metropolitan areas, and we grouped them by the rate of growth of immigrants during the 2000s, so during the last decade. And here we found that in some of the fastest growing places, you see the highest number, the highest share of the immigrant population has no high school education. So look at the third quartile, the third bar, 37% of all immigrants in the second fastest growing group of metropolitan areas, which are actually bigger than the fourth quartile. 37% of immigrants in those metropolitan areas didn't have a high school diploma. So the perception on the ground there was that there were more, and it is true in those places. So when you look at places like where there have been hot spots in terms of policy making and conflict, there are larger shares of low-skilled immigrants, and that has been skewing the perceptions nationwide in terms of the media picking up on this, in terms of people's perceptions more generally. Low-skilled do dominate those flows. But what we've found in our research, other than this, and I've done research in lots of different localities, one of the key factors about immigration and the perception of the damage that immigrants are doing to local economies or local neighborhoods has to do with the pace of change, not so much the size. So the faster the place is growing, the quicker people tend to react. And so it could be a very small immigrant population on the ground. So it's not that these places are being overwhelmed necessarily, but it's happening very quickly, and on the ground it feels like things are happening overnight. And the issues there are very real. And I think local leaders in those places have to deal with a lot of issues around fast growth of immigrants, particularly if they are low skilled and poor. Okay, so beyond the looking at the kind of the big picture stuff, we looked at each of the top 100 metropolitan areas. I'm going to show you a map of how that looks nationally. The upward-facing blue triangles are high-skilled destinations. The downward-facing red triangles are low-skilled destinations. And the green have a balanced ratio of immigrant skill levels. So you can see in terms of low skilled, the red triangles, largely in the Southwest. These are metropolitan areas that are heavily dominated by Mexican immigrants. Mexican immigrants are low skilled. Their education levels largely reflect educational standards in Mexico, which are lower than this country. And so you can see in the border states, California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, with Las Vegas as well. These are places that are dominated by low-skilled immigrants. But you also see a few sprinkled around in other places. The blue, the high-skilled destinations, are largely coastal, many on the East Coast, but also in the older industrial metros in the Great Lakes. And the balanced tend to be in eastern and southern states. They include a lot of the new destinations, surprisingly, like Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, and also many in the Midwest, like Chicago and a few other places. But I'm going to take you through a series of maps next, which will take this apart, and we can look at each of 8 kinds of immigrant gateways that comes out of a large body of research that I've been working on for a decade or so. And I've developed a typology of immigrant gateways that takes into account the history of settlement in local areas and how that's changed over time. And it encompasses the entire 20th century, and it's coming right at you in a series of 8 maps. So bear with me. It's kind of fun, actually, to look at them. The first set of immigrant gateways I call the former immigrant gateways. And the first thing to notice is that together they have a median skill ratio of 166. 166 high-skilled immigrants for every 100 low-skilled immigrants. So these are immigrant gateways of yesteryear. These are places like Cleveland and Detroit and Buffalo that had big industrial centers during the Industrial Revolution, attracted immigrants in huge numbers at that time, but became largely native-born, especially as those industries went away in those areas. So most of these places, Providence is the exception, are high-skilled, and Milwaukee is balanced, but these are places with small immigrant populations, very slow-growing immigrant populations, and largely high-skilled, fitting into certain kinds of industries in these places, like healthcare, technology, and education, that draws high-skilled specialty occupation immigrants. I will note one thing. Pittsburgh has the highest skill ratio of any metropolitan area in the country, in the top 100. It's over 300, it's about 330. So 330 BA or more to every 100 without a high school diploma. Many of these places are developing campaigns to draw immigrants in at this moment. They see immigrants as a source of economic development, of innovation, of replenishment and rejuvenation. There are campaigns going on, active campaigns going on in many of these places to bring in immigrants, which is contrary to what we usually think about what is happening in major places across the country. I have two kinds of continuous immigrant gateways. These are the major continuous immigrant gateways, and I will show you the minor ones in a second. These are places that are relatively high skilled. Median skill ratio is 129. There are 4 major continuous gateways. So these are places throughout the 20th century and continuing to this day have always gotten more than their fair share of immigrants. San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, New York, long settlement history, established immigrant infrastructure there on the ground, continue to get lots of immigrants from all over the place, and also have some high-skilled sectors that are bringing immigrants in, particularly in technology in San Francisco and Boston, finance in Chicago and New York. The minor continuous gateways look a little bit different. In particular, their skill ratio is much lower, and as a group, this is the lowest median skill ratio across each of the categories in the typology. These are places that either are in southwestern border states that have had a long history of Mexican settlement over a long period of time, but not huge numbers of immigrants over that period of time. And then several, 4 metropolitan areas in Connecticut that are largely suburbs and exurban areas of Boston and New York metropolitan areas. So there the composition is very different, dominated by non-Mexicans, Caribbean and others in those areas. Post-World War II immigrant gateways, these are some of the largest places in terms of the number of the foreign born in these places. They tend to have low skill ratios individually and collectively. The median skill ratio is 62. 3 of them are in California, Los Angeles and its neighbors, Riverside, San Bernardino, and San Diego. Dallas and Houston in Texas are in this category. Miami. These places all have huge numbers of immigrants. And Washington really stands out as the different egg, the odd egg in this category, because it has a skill ratio of 189, and it really stands out. It's a very diverse population. There's a lot of industry there that supports the federal government. There are international agencies there that draw high-skilled immigrants. So it's a different looking population, and one I know very well from living there. The emerging immigrant gateways are very fast-growing areas in terms of their immigrant population, and this is all sort of pre-recession talk. There were also places that attracted migrants, domestic migrants, US-born people, in huge numbers. You all live in one of them, Las Vegas. Phoenix was another one. Austin, Texas, Atlanta, Orlando. These places had some of the fastest rates of immigrant growth in the 1990s and in the 2000s as well. And these were places that had job creation and housing booms. And in some of these places, immigrants literally built the cities and the suburbs in terms of the housing and other buildings. So these are places that tended to attract lower skilled immigrants in those sectors, and that are now experiencing, some of them in the Mountain West are experiencing an outflow of immigrants, like Phoenix. Las Vegas is still growing. There's also a set of gateways, the re-emerging immigrant gateways. So these are places that looked a lot like the continuous gateways, with drawing large numbers of immigrants in the early part of the 20th century, but then became largely native-born until something happened in the 1990s, when things started to pick up in those places. Part of it was driven by refugee resettlement in places like Seattle and Portland and Sacramento and the Twin Cities. And part of it has just been sort of a delayed reaction in terms of receiving immigrants and attracting immigrants. They tend to have relatively high-skilled immigrants. Denver's the only low-skilled one. They have a median skill ratio of 125, and it's a very diverse set of areas, mostly coastal, but not exclusively. The pre-emerging immigrant gateways. These are places that really didn't hit the immigration radar till very late in the game. Included in are mostly southeastern metropolitan areas, including 3 in North Carolina, Nashville in Tennessee, a couple in Florida, but also Salt Lake City in the Mountain West. Low skill ratio of 82, very, very fast growing immigrant populations also being drawn by housing booms largely in these places. Very interesting set, smaller, much smaller immigrant populations, that's why they're designated as pre-emerging. And the last category is the rest of the metropolitan areas that I haven't mentioned. There's about 50 of them. These we've decided to call them low immigration metros because they don't receive a lot of immigrants and they haven't received a lot of immigrants in recent decades. They have a median skill ratio of 127. So where immigration is slow and slow growing, skill ratios tend to be higher. So that's the gateways typology by skill type. The implications on the ground are important. So first, the places that are growing fast are receiving immigrants of different skill levels, but many of them are receiving low-skilled immigrants, and that has some associations that go with it. Other places that are continuing immigrant gateways tend to have slower growth, but still get very high numbers of immigrants. And so the responses to immigrants on the ground in these places are very different. But this gives you a sense of what's happening across the country beyond the big picture, beyond the idea that, you know, we have one solid group of immigrants in this country. A quick note, because I know we don't have too much time. We looked at the characteristics of low-skilled and high-skilled immigrants and how they differed by gateway types, but just overall, you won't be surprised by the findings. The low-skilled immigrants are much more likely to be from Mexico and have lower English proficiency. High-skilled immigrants are much more likely to be naturalized U.S. citizens. We also looked at immigrant workers, both low and high-skilled, and compared them to their U.S.-born counterparts. And this is where things get really interesting. Low-skilled immigrant workers compared to U.S.-born, so that's, again, people without a high school diploma, are much more likely to be employed. 67% of immigrants that are low-skilled are employed versus 49% of the native-born, but their income is lower. They earn about $5,000 less annually, but their poverty rates, interestingly, are lower too. And that has to do with household size and the number of workers within each household, which is bringing down the poverty rates in the immigrant-headed households. Among high-skilled immigrant workers, they are somewhat less likely to be employed than their native-born counterparts, but it's not dramatic as it was among the low-skilled. Their income is lower. They earn about $8,100 less than their U.S.-born counterparts. Poverty rates are very low for high-skilled people across the board. I want to just finish with some concluding thoughts about how to reshape national immigration policy. With 40 million foreign-born persons living in the U.S. at this point, of all statuses, all different education levels, I think the U.S. has a competitive advantage for engaging globally, and this is the big talk right now. How is the U.S. going to recover from the economic downturn that we're in right now? How are we going to engage globally? How are we going to make that happen on the ground in local areas across the country? I would argue that there are these connections that are there, and we need to start taking advantage of them. We have more immigrants in this country than any other country has in the world. They're from a very diverse set of regions across the world, and we have the global connections. Are we well positioned to take advantage of them before other countries snatch them from us or use those connections in another way? Other countries have changed their policies to attract immigrants because they see the economic advantage, they see the competition globally as working in their favor. If they have immigrants are younger, they tend to be working, they tend to have this energy that comes with them. And finally, I just want to say something about the children of immigrants. Children of immigrants, by far, this is the key to our future. When you look at, I didn't get into the demography of the youth population, but it's very, very striking when you look at how diverse the youth population, the child population is right now. And the implications for that are important. So we've got 17 million, or almost 1/4 of all kids under the age of 18 are children of immigrants. And that's something that is very striking, not just in terms of linguistic or cultural or ethnic diversity, but in terms of what it's going to take to prepare this group to meet the needs of our future labor force. So we have a demographic dividend. We're not shrinking like our counterparts in Europe and other places around the world. And this kind of vibrant growth should not be squandered. So our mission really is to make sure, I think, that this next generation, both immigrants and the native-born, are prepared to take on our economic and our labor force needs in a way that gets us back on track and back into an economic position where we'd like to be. So I'll end there and take your questions.
I'm just confused, a methodological question. In the data that you provided, you're including those who are both authorized to be in the United States and those who are unauthorized. In your research, have you looked at these two groups separately? And do you see, I assume you see, significant differences in much of the data that you've provided to us, that there is a high proportion of that population that you presented that is not authorized, the low-skilled group and whatnot?
That's right.
And I assume also that perhaps your low-skilled group, your unauthorized group, may be somewhat undercounted because of the statistical problems of getting a good sample.
Right.
Could you elaborate a little
Sure,
bit on the difference?
absolutely. So it's impossible for us to identify the unauthorized in these data. These are, though, the most comprehensive data that we have on the foreign-born in the U.S., and we get the full range of characteristics of immigrants when we look at this data source, the American Community Survey. So it's not, we can't possibly do that. We do know from other surveys and from other research what the characteristics are like. But yeah, there's a close association between being unauthorized and being low-skilled, but not exclusively. And I can tell you from past research a long, long time ago that I did when I worked for the U.S. Department of Labor, there was a survey that I worked on that was congressionally mandated after the last legalization program in the late 80s that legalized about 3 million people who were in the country illegally. And so we had to look at the labor force characteristics and other market and social and housing and family characteristics of this group. And the majority of them were from Mexico and Central America. The majority of them were paid low wages. The majority of them were paid on the books, which surprised us somewhat. But there were people with high school degrees, college degrees, even graduate degrees and PhDs. So people can fall out of status for many different reasons, or they can arrive, surreptitiously come across the border. So the estimates right now are roughly about 60% of all people who are unauthorized to be in the United States came across the border without authorization, and about 40% came with a valid visa and then overstayed the terms of their visa. So yeah, these data include those people to the extent that they have been covered in this survey, and that gets to your second point. We don't really know who's missing. We don't know who's missing among the unauthorized, among the total immigrant population, among the US-born population. There are a lot of people who potentially are missing from census data. And some of the best estimates out there are from a demographer at the Pew Hispanic Center, Jeffrey Pissell. And he has put some boundaries around it, but I can't tell you what they are, but it's less than 50% are not included is his best guess, something around 25 to 30%. Yeah.
Is there are you or is there a study coming out that will show the economic benefit of the immigrants? In other words, it's, in my opinion here, it's easy to quantify the high skill, and it's a lot less easy to quantify the low skill. But I think it would be interesting to see that, because intuitively you'd think the benefit is there, but how do you
get at
it?
that?
Yeah.
I wish I could tell you I had a study coming out on that. And I have been working on that issue with another Brookings fellow. It's really a tough thing to get your arms around and to do it in a way that's satisfying. So the last time, the most credible report that had come out on this issue, which is now outdated, was a 2-year panel that the National Academy of Sciences put together with economists and demographers, and they thought about it, and they crunched numbers, and they put this report out, and nobody has really been able to touch it since then. At that time, and again, it's outdated, they were able to show that immigrants were a net benefit to the national economy, not by much, but definitely looked like a net benefit. I believe on the order, but don't quote me on this, $10 billion a year, so negligible. But states and localities paid a price. So that's where immigration is felt. And that's why there's this tension between states and the federal government and cooperation on different things, and state and local leaders taking matters in their own hands. So it's been really hard to get the next study out on that. There have been several studies that try to get at this in different ways, some of them more credible than others. Yeah.
Which is a segue into how much will state policy affect and shape national policy?
What do you think?
No, you're the expert. I don't get to Washington.
Well, it's really pushing things, and I would think that that's part of the effort, that states are pushing the feds by doing this, and it's provocative to a certain extent, but it's very real to another extent in terms of budgets and programs and policies that have to take place. So, there has been this void at the federal level, and there has been an effort to move state policy. So that's the only place that we actually see immigration policy happening right now. It's at the state and local level. And again, it's not all about crackdowns or restrictions on who can work and rent and get a license, but some of it is also an attempt to reach out to immigrants and to recognize that they're part of communities. Yeah.
Does the rise in high school immigrants account into international students? Does that include students who get their education here and return home, or is it simply students who get their education and stay here to work after college?
The second. So if they're still living in the U.S., and they're here, then they would be counted in these data. Yeah, we don't keep track very well of those who leave.
What did you kind of find out in your conversations in Nevada about, for example, this issue of having so many young the children of immigrants in Nevada, and having an aging Anglo population, and the tensions that are more or less inevitably going to emerge or are emerging at this point? Did that play into your thinking?
It's something I do think about, but my colleague Bill Fry, who has been here a couple of times, has done a lot of work on what he calls the culture gap, and that is older and aging white population having competing demands and priorities for using state and local money, competing with a more diverse young and youth population. So it does set up a tension, and this state has a lot of budget issues that it's dealing with already, and one thing that has come up is that as immigration has slowed, some institutions are trying their best to catch up. So, somebody here probably knows the statistics of like how often a school was built in the last couple of decades in this region and other things like that. But things were happening so fast, I think it was very hard for some institutions to keep up. Yeah.
When you discussed policy, you said that the evolving policy would put emphasis on employers to make sure that compliance was done. That happened in '86 too with the I-9. Wasn't the I-9 supposed to solve all that? Are they still using the I-9? I haven't heard much about it.
Still using it. It's still the law.
Why doesn't that?
It's still illegal for employers to hire people who are not authorized to work here. It has not been.
The wheel or what?
I would say that has minimally been enforced since the '86 law was implemented.
So no one checks it.
Exactly. And that's why states are doing their own policy around that particular issue. But
States can't check I-9. It's only a federal function.
no, but states can make their own laws, and they have, that says it's illegal for you to hire somebody who's not authorized to work here. So it's sort of like
But not the I-9. I mean, they can't audit an employer and say, where's your I-9? It's only the federal can do that. Is that correct?
I'm not sure about that. Two questions, one there and one there. First here.
I'm glad he asked that. What effect do you think would have the kind of initiatives on the state and local level regarding immigration would have on the governmental system as a whole? After all, immigration is supposed to be a federal question.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, this is what is the big question right now. Are we going to approach some kind of federalist system of immigration policy enforcement and other policy making, or are we going to actually decide that it is the federal government responsibility with interactions at the state and local level? I mean, it seems like we're not going to get any kind of federal reform before the next election, obviously. Possibly not after the next election. I mean, it was promised in this last round. So it's up for grabs. And back there.
I was wondering if you looked at where immigrants are going based on their skill level in comparison to the job creations that are going on in that state. Like, is it the labor market that's demanding a certain kind of immigrant to come to their city?
Right. I haven't looked at that myself, but other people are looking at that issue. Where are the jobs, both in terms of geographic location and in terms of industry and skill level? But one of the big questions is, are places drawing native-born and foreign-born workers of the same skill levels, or are they substituting for each other? Is there competition? These are big economic questions, and I don't have the answers. Sorry.
Is there a last question? Would anybody like the honor?
Don't let me end on, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question.
Come on. Was there a hand? I thought I saw a hand up. Nobody wants? the last question? Well, then I'll ask the last question. How about that? You mentioned that it's 13% of the country is immigrant, Audrey, and with the current downturn, that number for the next, if you had to project out, is that going to increase, decrease?
Big question. Well, what we've seen over the last decade is sort of a roller coaster ride in terms of levels of immigrant entry. So it has not been a steady increase, even though between 2000 and 2010, about 9 million new immigrants a net number, were added to the U.S. population. The 90s, it was about 11 million, so it's down. But it seems like the first half of the decade, or at least the period preceding the Great Recession, there was a little one in the early part of the decade, that immigration levels were still at the same level that we saw in the 90s. And then the recession hit and immigration came to a standstill, not just in the US, but worldwide. So people pretty much stopped coming to the US. And as unemployment rates went up, particularly in certain sectors, we saw some people going home, particularly very new unauthorized immigrants. They were leaving the country. And so we didn't see much growth, but now it seems to be growing again, which some would say is a sign of a promising sign in terms of, an economic turnaround, and others would say this is not a good time to have more immigrants. So I'll leave you with that thought.
Great. In closing, let's thank Audrey. Let me thank you all for coming. Hope we see you on the 15th of November. As always with our Brookings Talks, as you consider your own views on the topic, as you choose to participate in this issue, I hope we've given you some facts and information upon which to do that. Thanks.